all this? That's what he asked God. It sounded a little bit like Elijah. There's a time when Elijah said to God, all the people have turned away from you. I'm the only prophet who stands and preaches what's true and right, according to what you have said. And God says, well, Elijah, you don't know everything. There are others. But that sounds a whole lot like what Elijah was saying. So basically his complaint, his question to God was, you need to do something. What are you going to do, God, about these evil people, my own people? What are you going to do about them and their evil life? Well, God answers that question, which is nice. If you ask a question, it's good to hear the answer of that question. And that was kind of like the problem for Job. He kept asking questions and kept asking questions and kept getting all these responses from his friends. But finally, at the end of the book, he gets an answer from God. And God didn't really answer his question, but when he spoke, Job had no more questions. He was fine with that. But here, God answers the question that Habakkuk raises. God answers, I will judge them. That's his answer. Your people, the people of Judah, God's people who are living a wicked life, God says, I will judge them. That's what you want, Habakkuk, right? You want me to do something? I will judge them. Look at starting in verse 5. Look at the nations and watch and be utterly amazed. For I am going to do something in your days that you would not believe, even if you were told. I am raising up the Babylonians, that ruthless and impetuous people, who sweep across the whole earth to seize dwelling places not their own. They are a feared and dreadful people. They are a law to themselves and promote their own honor. Their horses are swifter than leopards, fiercer than wolves at dusk. Their cavalry gallops headlong. Their horsemen come from afar. They fly like vultures, like a vulture swooping to devour. They all come bent on violence. Their hordes advance like a desert wind and gather prisoners like sand. They deride kings and scoff at rulers. They laugh at fortified cities. They build earthen ramps and capture them. Then they sweep past like the wind and go on. Guilty men whose own strength is their God. God says, I'm going to give you an answer, Habakkuk, but you're not going to believe me. Even as I answer it, you're not going to believe what I'm going to do. I'm going to send the Babylonians, a terrible, awful, ungodly, ruthless people. I will raise them up, he says, and I will use that nation to bring judgment to Judah. Since we know this story, we know that Babylon came in and with King Nebuchadnezzar, and he came in and he took the people captive out of Jerusalem and took them on up to Babylon. And in the process of things, he destroyed the entire city of Jerusalem. Destroyed the walls, destroyed the homes, destroyed the temple of God, which the Jews of that day thought there is no way ever that God would allow his temple to be destroyed. But it was destroyed by the Babylonians. We know that. We're familiar with that story. But for Habakkuk, that was brand new news. He'd never heard that God was going to send this evil nation of Babylon. He knew about Babylon. Remember, there's the kingdom of Assyria, and then that was overthrown by the kingdom of Babylon. He knew about Babylon, and he knew how they were conquering the world. He knew about that ruthless people, but he never, in any thought in his mind, could figure that God would use Babylon as the nation to come and bring judgment on Judah. So for Habakkuk, this was all brand new news to him, and so he responds accordingly. Question number 2. But God, how can you do it that way? Now remember what he asked at first. When are you going to do something, God? And God answers the question. And then after he answers that question, Habakkuk's his next question, complaint, is, but God, how can you do it that way? Look at over in still in chapter 1, starting in verse 12. I'm going to read all the way down to chapter 2, verse 1. O Lord, are you not from everlasting? It seems like Habakkuk's trying to butter up God a little bit at the beginning of this. He says, O Lord, are you not from everlasting? My God, my Holy One, we will not die. O Lord, you have appointed them to execute judgment. O Rock, you have ordained them to punish. Your eyes are too pure to look on evil. You cannot tolerate wrong. Why then do you tolerate the treacherous? Why are you silent while the wicked swallow up those more righteous than themselves? You have made men like fish in the sea, like sea creatures. They have no ruler. The wicked foe pulls all of them up with hooks. He catches them in his net. He gathers them in his dragnet, and he rejoices and is glad. Therefore he sacrifices to his net and burns incense to his dragnet. For by his net he lives in luxury and enjoys the choicest food. Is he to keep on emptying his net, destroying nations without mercy? I will stand at my watch and station myself on the ramparts. I will look to see what he would say to me and what answer I am to give to this complaint. So that's Habakkuk's response to God with his question. How can you do it that way, God? They're more treacherous than we are. They are more evil than our people. I said our people were bad, but they're worse. How can you use that type of people to bring judgment against your own people? In verse 13, he says, why are you silent while the wicked swallow up those more righteous than themselves? Now all of a sudden, Judah doesn't look so bad to Habakkuk. Now we were bad, but they're worse. So we are more righteous than they are. And God, and he says, these people are evil. In fact, as we can see really from God's answer of the first question, at the very end of that, about verse 11 or so, God talks about their idolatry, that their power is their idolatry. And then Habakkuk, in his question / complaint, says that they are bringing, like a fisherman bringing in all the fish, they are worshiping their power and their ability that they can conquer nations. That was their God, their power. They looked at what they had as more powerful than anyone else, and everything was spiritual back then. Everything was about a God. If one nation destroyed another nation, they felt like, well, that meant that their God was stronger than the other nation's God. And so Habakkuk just cannot believe this. He can't believe that God would send a nation like the Babylonians to bring judgment on God's people. And so he asks that question, makes that complaint, and then he says, I am going to stand at my watch until you answer me. And he waits for God to answer. And God does answer in chapter 2 as well. God's second answer to Habakkuk: justice will be done eventually. So as Habakkuk is complaining that God is using an evil nation, he doesn't understand what's going on, and he says, how can you allow them to do this? God says, justice will be done eventually. I want to just read a couple of verses of this, of the Lord's answer. The whole chapter is his answer. And you can go back and look at some more of that. But look at verse 2 and 3. Then the Lord replied, write down the revelation and make it plain on tablets, so that a herald may run with it. For the revelation awaits an appointed time. It speaks of the end and will not prove false. Though it linger, wait for it. It will certainly come and will not delay. God says, you better write this down just so you make sure that you remember this and somebody else remembers this, because this will happen. It's just not going to happen right away. Eventually, this judgment will come. He's answering Habakkuk. He says, I'm using them for a season, and then I will eventually judge them for their sin as well, but that will be later. And basically, the whole rest of this chapter, God speaks about the evil of that nation of Babylon, which as we can look at it, you can see he's describing the evil of worldliness and the evil of the world. Here in chapter 2 is a judgment against Babylon. But because God does not change, it can also be recognized basically as a judgment against evil. And God is saying, evil will be judged eventually. Keeps bringing that point back to Psalm 73. When are you going to take care of these evil people? You know, everything's going so well for them. And then the psalmist recognizes, as we were reading through that, yes, they will have their judgment, and we will have our reward as we are faithful to God. And at Habakkuk, it's the same thing. When are you going to judge? I mean, first of all, he wants them to judge Judah. Then he can't understand how God's going to do that. Then he wants them to judge Babylon, and God says, I will judge them eventually. And this is the way God does things. He waits and waits and waits and gives opportunity for repentance, gives opportunity for a change in life, and eventually to that point he'll finally say, your day is coming, your day has come. In fact, here in a few weeks we're going to talk about the day of the Lord, something I mentioned earlier as we began studying the minor prophets, a message that we see in the minor prophets and in other places as well. And we're going to talk about that sometime soon, but this was kind of like God was saying, okay, their day will come. Their day of judgment is coming, and you better write this down so you don't forget, but it's going to take some time before I'm ready to take care of that. It's one thing I thought was very interesting in what God said about these evil people was the futility of idolatry. Now remember the situation for them with idolatry. It was you take a piece of stone and you carve it, chisel it, and form something from it. Or you take a piece of wood